Kimberly Cauble Photography, and I want to welcome you to my very first YouTube video. Just to give you a quick little introduction of who I am and why I'm doing this. I am a wife, a mom. I have 2 little boys. I am also a middle school teacher and a part-time photographer, wedding and portrait photographer in the Charlotte area. And I love to combine my passions, photography and teaching. I love to teach children, students about photography, and some of my photography club kids encouraged me to try this. So we're gonna see what happens. So my goal is to provide you with some educational content about photography on a level that even a 6th grader can understand. So I know there's a lot of content out there, and a lot of it's very technical and very, very challenging to understand. So I'm going to try to teach you some things about photography on a level that even 10 and 11-year-olds might be able to understand. So whether you're 10 or 11, or you're 50, or you're 80, whether you're brand new to photography or you are just looking to hone in your skills a little bit, my goal is to provide some of that content to you to help you understand really what's happening to make these images that you are trying to create with your camera. So today what I'm going to try to tackle, I like to refer to as the holy trinity of photography, which is the exposure triangle. That is one of the most basic things you really need to understand in order to work your cameras, especially if you plan on using your camera in manual mode. So we have aperture. I'm going to try to explain aperture to you in a way that makes sense. Shutter speed is the second part of the triangle, and then ISO, which is kind of the most mysterious, but I will try to explain to you in a way that makes sense and how it all works. So think about the word photography. I always teach my students about Greek and Latin roots. Photography, the word itself, photo is light, and graph is writing. So the word photography itself is actually writing with light. So in order to understand photography, really you need to understand what your camera is doing with the light. My wedding photographer, Carol McDaniel, who is one of my inspirations, told me back when I was picking her brain about wedding and portrait photography, that you have to learn how to see the light. And I didn't quite understand that, but the more I have grown in my photography expertise, the more I understand light is essential. So understanding how the light gets into your camera and helps expose your image is all about these 3 things: aperture, shutter speed, and the ISO. All help your camera see the light and capture the light in a way that you want it to work. Let's talk about aperture for just a second. Aperture is something my uncle tried to explain to me back when I was in high school. Those were the days before digital photography. The camera I was using to take pictures was an old 35mm point and shoot film camera, and I had no idea how it worked. And so he started going on. He's a fantastic photographer, my uncle is, but I did not understand anything about what he was talking about. So one of the first things I had to learn as a photographer, as a real photographer, really understanding how it works, is why does the film work that way? Why does my camera work that way? So aperture is basically I correlate it with your eyes. It is the lens of your camera. Is just like your eyeball. So let me show you a little graphic that I made. Please don't judge my awful drawings. I usually do this on the board in my classroom. But I did a little drawing to help you understand. Let's see if I can get it right here. How a camera lens works with, or kind of correlates with your eyeball. So we know that in our eyeball, we have a pupil. And the pupil opens and closes in response to light. So your lens can do the same thing, although you have to control it. It doesn't do it automatically like our eyes do. So when you have, let's say when your eyes have a lot of light coming into them, you're looking directly into the sun, there's a lot of light surrounding you, what happens to your pupil? it shrinks. It's small. It closes down to let in less light so that you can see better. That's why even when we are in a bright summer day, we put our hands over our eyes to try to lessen that light so that we can see better. Well, the same thing is happening to your camera lens when you adjust your aperture. So when you have, let's see if I can get this right, the camera lens with this very small opening, that is a small aperture, and it lets in less light, but it allows your camera to see better, basically, to provide you with more clarity, a greater depth of field, a greater focus with everything that you're looking at. And then as you adjust, just like your eyeball, as it adjusts to the light coming into it, as the aperture adjusts, you are either letting in less light or more light. The more light that you let in, like down here in this bottom, your pupil is wide open. That's like when your eyes are dilated. When you go to the doctor, the eye doctor, and they dilate your eyes to check everything out, and then everything's really bright and they force you to wear sunglasses because your eyes are so dilated. That's what's happening when you open up your camera aperture to the small number. It lets in a lot more light, but it also reduces your depth of field and makes only the thing that you are looking directly at really more crisp or in focus. We call that bokeh. Where everything else is kind of blurry, but the thing that you're focusing on is very clear. So how that works with photography, or how you need to understand that, when you're shooting in manual, you need to manipulate that aperture to let in the correct amount of light. So if you're in a very dark room, you're going to want to open that up to let in more light. If you are out in the bright sun, you're going to want to close it down to let in less light. Just like your eyeball closes in, or your pupil closes and opens based on the amount of light that you're working in. And on cameras, depending on what camera you use, there is a way, if you're shooting in manual mode, to control the aperture. I shoot with Nikons. I'm not a camera brand snob, but I started with Nikon, so that's why I've kind of stuck with it. It's hard to replace and switch to a totally new brand with the expensive lenses. But anyway, I know that when I have my aperture, there's a little button on the top here for exposure, and then I can adjust with the wheel at the back here, and that will help me adjust my aperture. So if I am in a place where there's not as much light, I might make the aperture small, or open it up, make the number small. The numbers are backwards for my brain anyway. I always have to kind of reverse things. So when I think of small aperture, it's actually the higher numbers. So f7, f16, f22, and then medium aperture is like f4, f5, 6, f8, and then the wide open aperture are the smallest numbers, like 1.4, 1.2 even, 1.8, 2.8. I usually shoot portraits in between like f1.4 and f4. But if I'm shooting landscapes and I want everything in crisp clarity, then I will adjust my aperture to be like bigger numbers and then close it down a little bit so that I can see things in clarity. So playing around with your aperture helps you account for the light, but also account for the depth of field and the focus that you want. If you have a camera that is a DSLR or one of the new mirrorless systems, you can usually find in your menu or a setting on your camera to focus particularly on aperture priority, so that you can play around with just that instead of having to try to juggle aperture, shutter speed, and ISO at the same time. If you're learning manual, try just aperture priority first and play around with those numbers and see what you can get. Just to show you a little bit of the effect that changing the aperture can have on your images, if you take a look at this cute little Friends Lego set and pay close attention to, I believe it's Monica's character, the one in the foreground on the right side, as well as the service little exit sign in the very background. At 2.8, Monica is very clear and crisp, and the service exit arrow is very blurry. But as you progress through the apertures, as you continue to close down your lens, things become clearer and clearer until at about f22, everything is crisp and clear in the scene. So next, we're going to talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed, if you think about the film days, back in the days when I first started shooting, before digital was born, shutter speed relates to the amount of light you expose to the film and the timing that you expose the film. So if you are trying to capture something and have a freeze frame, you want your shutter speed to be quick, because then you're just going to capture that very moment. So somebody jumping in the air and you want them frozen in time, you would want a really high shutter speed. If you are trying to get creative with blur or create photography with like waterfall pictures and you want that really soft waterfall, you would slow down the shutter speed. And then that would allow the film to be exposed to more light, to more of what's happening. Because as soon as you open up a shutter, you're exposing your image to light. So if you have a very fast shutter speed, but it's really dark outside, you're not going to capture very much light. You might not see anything on your film or in your camera, on your image, because you haven't exposed it to enough light. But if it's really bright outside, you may want to have a much faster shutter speed, because you don't want too much light coming into your camera, because then it's going to be really blown out. That's what we call blown out exposures, when there's just too much light exposed. So shutter speed allows you to sort of slow down, speed up the shutter. That's the little clicker basically in the camera that opens up and closes and exposes that image and creates that image. So there's another way to play around with that on your camera. Usually there's a shutter speed, shutter priority. You can kind of mess around with your camera manuals to find that. Rule of thumb though, got a little graphic. Let me see if I can find it here. So if you are trying, my happy spot, you can see right here is I put 1/250. That is usually where I capture pretty clear photographs, portraits. If I'm at a wedding reception, I might want to speed it up even more if people are really moving around and dancing. But that's a really, a nice little spot. But if you're going to get really creative and you want to slow down your shutter speed, you also need to account for your hands. We are not perfect at holding. See, my camera my here setup just shook because I shook the table. And that happens with your camera. You can never hold your camera stable enough below about 1/60. So you may need a tripod to use slower shutter speeds. I also have still life or in the dark, or if you're trying to capture something blurry, you may want to slow it down a little bit. If you're trying to capture, basketball player making a shot, you want to speed it up. So 1/500, 1/1000, 1/2000. The faster the action is, if you want to capture that split second frozen in time, speed up your shutter. Now, if you're trying to capture action with a little bit of blur, you can slow it down some. You just have to play around with what you like best about that. I know blur right now is a very trendy thing. So playing around with your shutter speed can help you get that trend, achieve those trendy things. Now, playing with shutter speed can arguably give you some pretty cool effects. These are just a few images that, oh my goodness, they're from such a long time ago. This first couple is the Ferris wheel at the Toys R Us in New York City, and this was sometime in like 2011 or 2012. I don't even think there is a Toys R Us anymore, but I took a picture of it at a very high shutter speed so that it was frozen in time, and then I took a picture of it at a slower shutter speed using a tripod that shows you the movement of the actual Ferris wheel. Kind of did the same thing with the subway. If you put your camera on a tripod, slow down your shutter speed. Of course, make sure you expose for the correct amount of light. You can get really cool car trails or light trails as the subway passes by. And the same thing I did for the city of Charlotte. This is such an old photograph I took in a photography class when I was first beginning to learn how to use my camera. And we went up in an overpass and put our cameras on tripods, adjusted the shutter speed for the correct exposure, and then caught some super car trails. This last picture, as an example of kind of shutter speed at work, is what we refer to as ghosting. I took this on the 4th floor of Winthrop University, which is supposedly haunted. I had one of my photography club students stand still, and the other ones kind of move around him at a slow shutter speed, and then you end up with this really creative, interesting ghosting type image. Let's talk about the third part of the exposure triangle, and that is ISO. ISO is, to me, the most mysterious of the exposure triangle. It stands for, which also doesn't make sense, International Organization of Standardization, which that's iOS, which is like our Apple operating systems. So I guess that's maybe why they changed it or kept it at ISO instead of iOS. Anyway, it stands for International Organization of Standardization, but it doesn't really have anything to do with an organization. It has to do with, if you know film or if you understand film speed. So the best way I can explain this is the lower the number, the slower the film speed, but the clearer your images will be. So if you have an ISO at 200, you're going to be pretty clear with your picture. And your film speed's going to be, if you're on an outside day shooting, that's probably a really good ISO to keep. The darker it is, the higher up you might need your ISO to go. So on a, darker afternoon as the sun's going down, you may need to bump it up to ISO 400 or ISO 800. But what happens when you change your ISO is you are also allowing more light into the exposure, but it creates what we call grain or noise. And it's not necessarily blur, but it's just fuzzy. The picture appears a little fuzzier. So it just depends on your preference. Personally, I don't like a lot of grain in my portraits, in my images. However, if I know I don't have a lot of light and I really want to capture a clear image, then I'm going to bump up my ISO so that I can accommodate for less light, unless I decide to use a flash, and then I can, flash is a whole different ball game. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But ISO, depending on your camera, my older camera, higher ISOs create more noise and more grain, but my newer cameras are a lot better with that. I even shot with somebody who had their ISO accidentally on auto recently, and some of their ISOs were up at like 20,000, yet their pictures were fairly clear because it was a mirrorless camera, and the technology these days, the advanced technology, is pretty crazy. So I try to keep my ISO as low as possible, but if I need to bump it up in order to accommodate for less light in the room, then I can do that. To show you the differences that ISO can make in the grain or the noise in your images, pay close attention to the reflection down at the bottom of this little Lego set, the reflection on the table. At ISO 200, everything's shiny and clear, but then as you progress up into higher ISOs, 600, 1600, 3200, 6400, the reflection gets a little grainy or noisy, as we say. Now, the image itself isn't making that big of a difference because of technology these days. You can crank up your ISO, but it's usually in the dark, dead space of a photo that you will see more grain occur with higher ISOs. So you've got Aperture, you've got shutter speed, and you've got ISO. Together, those make the exposure triangle. And if you can learn how to manipulate the three of those, you can create pretty much any image in your camera that you want to. It's all about the exposure to light and how you want the light to hit your image, to be recorded in that image. And those three things will help you out. So hopefully this has been a little bit of a help to you. Like this video if you found it beneficial, if it helped you, if you learned something. Follow if you want to know a little bit more. I will be creating some of these throughout the summers when I'm not teaching school, maybe throughout the school year. I can't promise that I'm going to produce a ton of content right off, but I will try to get in there and do a little bit, especially if you guys reply and let me know some things you want to learn about. Comment if you have anything that you are curious about, if you'd like to see me try to tackle teaching on a 6th grade level. And thanks for watching, I guess. Have a great day.